The US has deported 250 alleged gang members to El Salvador, despite a court ruling ordering them to halt flights. And just when you thought the US immigration system couldn't get any more draconian, Trump has decided to dust off the wartime 1798 Alien Enemies Act. Yeah, the same law used to justify the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II to push these deportations through. And then Bukele tweets this, the president of El Salvador. Oopsie, he says, too late. Now, doesn't really feel like an oopsie when the Human Rights Watch, found that hundreds of Salvadorians deported to the US were killed or abused. The Human Rights Watch literally says that specifically there were 138 Salvadorans were murdered from 2013 to 2019, and 70 others were abused or sexually assaulted. Before we unpack this a little more, I want to bring Noffel in because I'm really keen to hear his thoughts on this. The US created the conditions that have given rise to gang violence in El Salvador through Cold War interventions, mass deportations, and economic exploitation. Isn't this a form of neo-colonial violence to now deport people into the very crisis America helped manufacture?
Well, let's take a look at the two nations which Trump has targeted this weekend through the wartime law. So we've got El Salvador, which throughout the 80s, Reagan's administration had basically given the equivalent of $1 million every day to military juntas whose main overall goal was to crush civilians. And a lot of these death squads carried out what's known as the El Mozote massacre, in which they're still finding bodies today of women and children. And then we go over to Venezuela, which has long been crippled by US sanctions. And United Nations reports that about 100,000 people have died as a result of that. So for decades, the US has long seen Latin America essentially as its own colony. They'll extract resources to enrich American companies and their markets. They'll force regime change through military coups, crush leftist opposition and civilians through death squads. And when all of that basically fails, they'll just decide instead to enact deadly economic blockades that makes countries unlivable. So I would say any sort of gang violence, like you said, that has been brought up by US conditions is really the result of US intervention. And any gangs that are, I say gangs because the wartime law allows for people to be deported without charge or trial. Really, the US needs to take some sort of accountability here.
Will they ever take accountability for doing these atrocious things?
I really don't think they will.
Mm.
The foreign policy has destabilized these nations a lot. But the important thing to note is we are seeing consent being manufactured in real time. So while though one can say, okay, well, these are violent criminals, because of the same act that was used during World War II towards Japanese citizens, there's going to be many that are innocent, many that are innocent. And so what we'll end up seeing is, unlike in World War II, where in the 80s, the Japanese citizens were rewarded with some sort of compensation, these people are going to be ending up going to jails where they could possibly die, where they're going to have no sort of legal representation, and it's all going to be done in the name of foreign deportation and basically creating an enemy for Trump to target.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you make a really great point there. This this scapegoating of people that they can easily racialize, right? And this is an act that's obviously infamous for being used to suppress political dissent as well, and target immigrants. And I think particularly those that are deemed politically inconvenient. I think his reliance on this law, I think, serves as some sort of like ominous precedent. But what shocks me the most is that he's trying to skip over the standard immigration procedures that are actually in the US at the moment, including court hearings and access to a fair trial and the due process and protections. So, like you said, the removal of consent or the ability to present evidence in their defense is completely removed. So those sorts of actions undermine the fundamental principles of justice and rule of law, which is what America seems to pretend to stand on. They say that, yeah,
Pretend, yeah.
they pretend. Like, I think it's all this is a facade, essentially. But I also think that the Aliens Act, even the name itself, I think, is a law that's rooted in xenophobia and has been resurrected all for political theatre. I think we know that Trump is this, you know, boisterous and ridiculous political actor. And I think he's now extending this application as a means to blur the lines between crime and war. So the logic here is deeply flawed. But yeah, I do have another question for you actually, because if we
Yeah.
actually absorb this, it's a law that's written before the invention of the steam engine, before the abolition of slavery, and before women could even vote, and now it's being used as a means to uh, to target migrants, which I think is Trump's aim here. But what I'm really keen to know is why is the US government so quick to criminalize entire groups of migrants, branding them as gang members, when its own domestic white supremacist militias who actually pose a proven threat are left untouched and even pardoned?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really a question you could ask since the invention of institutions within the US, like the military or police. You know, you take a look at police, and they were formed out as things like slave patrols. Historically, have had the ability to crush unions, ask for higher pay for essentially saying more violence, and like you've said, they pose a real threat. There's a real demographic of people that go into the military that tour in these countries, like in the Middle East, and they come and they have a higher proportion to commit violent crime. Not these immigrants, by the way, that are coming over the border. It's people at home that are radicalized throughout this system. And I think it's really important. There was a French Marxist named Althusser, and he wrote about it. And he said there's two types of institutions that you get. You'll get a repressive state apparatus, and you get a ideological. And it really seems that the more extreme Trump's economic policy gets in terms of gutting the state, he needs more and more populist framing of enemies. And it comes purely into this idea that there's no more soft power anymore. There's no more guiding of principles ideologically like the Democrats did in the name of freedom and democracy. It's all complete hard power to completely gut the state as he's doing. And it's what Naomi Klein would call the shock doctrine effect. Make sure everyone's overwhelmed right now. They don't understand anything that's going on. Come next election cycle, things will be terrible, and they won't know which direction to go through.
Mm, absolutely. I think that's a really, really great point as well, to be fair. And I think it kind of paves the way for even more radical abuses of power. I think we're seeing Trump really exert too much power. And I think what we need to do is kind of mobilize together and expose that strategy, that this is not about safety, but about him consolidating authoritarian rule, essentially, under the guise of law enforcement and under the guise of I want to protect America and I want to protect
Yeah.
our civil liberties. But what he's doing is he's creating this us versus them narrative that you aren't good enough to be in America, so therefore go away. And also it sets that precedent, doesn't it? So everyone who sees this happening, because I was looking on Twitter, and I don't normally go through Twitter at all because sometimes it's an absolute minefield.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
under Kelly's oopsie tweet, there were so many people being like, "Yeah, good, get them gone. Why should we have to deal with them in the US?" And that to me is so frightening because people are
Yeah.
backing the fact that he's brought this outdated wartime act into fruition.
100%. And I think it really speaks to this boomerang effect, in which, if you take a look at Latin America throughout the 1900s up until now, and how America has essentially treated citizens, it's a boomerang effect. It's called the imperial boomerang, where anything that you subject other civilians to in other nations will come back to bite you in the end, because the same rhetoric that they use. So military juntas or the death squads I was talking about under Reagan, or all these different forms of opposition and control in terms of dissenting free speech in, let's say, Guatemala, where
Yeah.
the US famously turned it into this banana republic. The same free speech dissent is coming now. We've just seen a green card legal citizen in the US, Mahmoud Khalil, who's in detention for simply free speech, which I thought the right apparently loved, but seems not. And it will take time. It will take time. People may not see the full effects now, except for their grocery bills, but over time, as things become more and more shifting to the right, because we know the Democrats aren't going to move left, they're going to move right, things will appear to affect the average American citizen more in their civil liberties than they think right now.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.